Okay, so good morning again, and welcome for those who joined us just in the last couple of minutes. This is the webinar on pathways to credible net zero governance, hosted by the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the LSE. This webinar is being recorded, and you can use question and answer function to ask your questions, which we will take towards the middle of this webinar once we have presented the findings of the report that we're launching today. So today actually is a very important day, as many of you know. The and climate change negotiations, the COP28, has started this morning in Dubai. And the negotiations are starting against a very worrying backdrop of strong evidence of, on one hand, inadequate ambition in terms of emission reductions already committed by countries through their nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. And on the other hand, inadequate credibility of those pledges and their implementation. You probably have seen that the latest emission gap report from the UN Environmental Programme has pointed out that the current pledges under the Paris Agreement put the world on track for a 2.5 to 2.9 degrees Celsius temperature rise above pre-industrial levels, which is, of course, nowhere near the objective of the Paris Agreement to keep the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. On the other hand, if we look at the pledges that the countries are putting forward, as of today, more than 70 countries have committed to net zero targets. And those net zero targets on paper cover about 80% of global emissions. However, if we check to what extent those countries have actually been integrated through the national legal and governance systems, the picture is not so rosy. So our discussion today is set to look at how countries are taking political commitments on net zero, what drives political ambition, and also what drives integration of that political ambition through the national climate governance system so that we can ensure effective implementation. We have a very exciting panel today. So at the beginning of this event, we are going to present the findings of the report that we have published very recently at the Grantham Research Institute. And this will be followed by discussion with experts that have firsthand knowledge of challenges that some of the countries we're talking about today. I would like to present our panel. So my name is Alina Averchenkova. I'm the Distinguished Policy Fellow at the Grantham Research Institute, focusing on climate legislation and governance, and I will chair the discussion today. Then I will share the presentation with my colleague, Tiffanie Chan, who is a policy analyst as well at the Grantham Research Institute and is a co-author on the report that we're presenting today. And then this will be followed by the discussion with our experts, Katherine Cooke, who is a principal consultant, climate finance and policy at Oxford Policy Management and Commonwealth, or Oxford Policy Management. And Katherine was actually a Commonwealth National Climate Finance Advisor for the government of Fiji in 2021 and 2023. And Fiji is one of the deep dive case studies that our report has considered. So very much looking forward to Katherine's insights on learnings from Fiji. And this will be then followed by a discussion with Professor Mikel González-Eguino, who is Ikerbasque professor at the BC3 Basque Center for Climate Change. And Mikel has long-term experience on climate change policy and economics and has been advising the government of Spain, which is our second deep dive case study that we're considering today. So very much looking forward to the roundtable discussion with our experts. And as I mentioned, you will all have a chance to ask questions using Q&A function. So please, looking forward to your questions and comments. And now we're going to go to in the next 20 to 25 minutes to share the key findings from our report with you. So as the COP28 advances, very important outcome that is expected is the conclusion of the first global stocktake, where countries are assessing progress made to date with the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And the outcome of that global stocktake will inform the next round of the nationally determined contributions to be submitted in 2025 with target for 2035. And one of the challenges in that discussion is how to raise the ambition, and most importantly, how to ensure that the next round of ambition actually gets translated and into national climate governance systems and gets implemented. So in our report, we look at what we call a governance pathway, which is the transition of the country from making the political commitment to net zero and to ambitious targets to support that net zero commitment, to then integrating that into their legal systems. And we will discuss a bit more the pathways, but that in some cases would mean integrating it into the national climate law. In other cases, passing executive policies that integrate net zero target, but most importantly, making sure that the key elements of governance infrastructure, such as periodic review of targets, process for setting intermediate targets to get to long-term net zero, but also such elements as knowledge provision and independent assessment, accountability for implementation, public participation, and finance are all in place, which would then enable implementation of that commitment. And what is important, this governance pathway is not linear. So what we again discovered in our analysis is that getting political commitment to pass net zero is just the start of the journey. And actually, it's most important that that commitment is maintained and amplified as the country moves deeper into the implementation phase, because that's when specific policies actually start to bite. And that's when we see in a number of countries, the political commitment becomes more of a challenge. So this is one of the critical messages that we would like to pass today. So if we start looking at the first step in this, how do we actually get to political commitment to net zero? We have looked at the number of drivers, having reviewed the existing literature on net zero commitments, but also having conducted 2 in-depth studies on Fiji and Spain, where we have interviewed a wide range of policy stakeholders in each country, covering policy experts, government representatives, private sector, and civil society campaigners and academics. We have designed this framework, which you can see on this diagram, which outlines the key drivers that determine and help country to take political commitment to net zero, but also a number of strategies that countries are using and different actors within the countries are using to amplify those drivers and to push countries towards net zero commitment. What is important to note that for each national context, the relative importance of different drivers will be different. But what we have noticed, they do play a role to some extent in most of the cases. So I will not go through all of them, but I will highlight a few. So for example, the first one is the importance of international peer pressure and leadership. And why I wanted to highlight that is that over the years, there has been quite a lot of critique to the international process on climate change being slow, negotiations not really being necessarily in sync with the urgency that we have and need to have to address climate change. Yet what we have found out through the case studies on Fiji and Spain, but also the broader literature review on experiences of other countries, is that the Paris Agreement is being one of the key decisive factors in putting pressure and also creating the basis for countries to take domestic legal obligation on net zero. That highlights the importance of having strong international framework and updating that international framework towards greater ambition going forward. There are also other factors in terms of international pressure, such as the role of trade partners. We have noticed, for example, in South Korea, their commitment towards net zero was influenced by their trade partners such as US, Japan, and China, putting pressure and kind of advancing on climate policies. And oftentimes, it's not just the commitment that is enshrined in the Paris Agreement, but a broader sense of wanting to be a leader among the peers. And that, for example, came very strongly in the Fiji case study. Fiji aspires to be a leader in the Pacific and therefore feels that its own actions would inform the region. But also very importantly, and that was really interesting conclusion from the Fiji study, being a very vulnerable small island developing state, which faces quite a lot of development challenges, instead of only focusing on their adaptation and resilience policy, Fiji decided to go for this ambitious net zero commitment, partially because they wanted to feel that they're leading by example. They wanted to push the other countries, such as large emitters, through taking action themselves and leading by example. So they felt that to be credible, they actually needed to act first themselves, which is a very interesting kind of driver for net zero. And in terms of strategies, what we noted is that what has worked in countries is engaging prominent political leaders and creating climate champions helps to advance political commitment. And oftentimes countries hosting COP meetings, international negotiations, has been a decisive factor, for example, in Spain and Chile, also in Mexico, President Calderon a role as hosting the COP has advanced domestic climate policy and led to the adoption of the climate law. The other factors, as you can see, I'll take another example. Of course, on the domestic side, what we discovered is domestic social pressure is a very important driver for net zero commitments. So many countries, in particular civil society, placing social pressure on the government to make political commitment has really made a big difference. In particular, campaigning, also litigation in court, and public opinion surveys have been important in enabling such political commitment. For example, leading up to Spain's adoption of the climate change law that contains net zero target, Royal Elcano Institute held public opinion surveys, which showed that the vast majority of the public believed that Spain should have a climate change law. And there was also evidence of high level of support for a net zero target and having an independent scientific committee on climate change, which basically helped advance the political commitment to net zero and to climate legislation. What is important also to note that social pressure for net zero transition often really comes from the private sector. So politically active stakeholders, for example, by prominent business associations, and individual companies also played a great role in advancing a net zero debate in Spain by being able to demonstrate economic opportunity that net zero transition brings. And that is something I also wanted to highlight, the importance of economic opportunities, which we're going to talk more about in the roundtable section of today's discussion. But in both Fiji and Spain, but also across other countries that we have looked at, economic opportunity narrative was a key strategy in getting countries to commit to net zero. if we compare the insights from the two case studies, Spain and Fiji, and I should say, why did we pick those two countries? And we wanted to test our framework and to get deeper insights on what is actually happening in terms of political commitment and implementation of net zero. So we picked two countries which are very different. One is very vulnerable, small island developing state, as I mentioned, Fiji, which faces very high impacts from climate change, and yet has committed to net zero and integrated it into its national climate law. Spain, on the other hand, of course, is a member of the European Union and therefore is informed by the European commitment on climate change and actually has legal obligation under the European climate law, but has also adopted national climate law with net zero target and is now advancing on implementation. And while being very different, what you can see on that slide, that the key drivers for net zero commitment actually are somewhat similar. There are a lot of synergies. So in both cases, international peer pressure and drive for leadership, as well as supranational legal requirements, have been very important. In Spain, it's the role of the European legislation. In Fiji, as I mentioned, it's their aspiration to lead within the region and internationally. The message of economic opportunity and just transition in delivering net zero was particularly important in Spain, as the country expects to benefit from renewables and in general leadership in low carbon technologies, while in Fiji, there was strong expectation that their active stance on mitigation and this ambitious commitment to net zero will help raise international climate finance, which would allow them to enable both low carbon transition, but also help meet adaptation needs. And it's very important that this expectation is met by the international climate community. So these are the key highlights on what actually drives countries to get to net zero commitment. But our second question was, well, once that commitment is in place, how do we actually move towards effective implementation of that commitment to through the national climate governance system? And I'll pass to Tiffanie to share the results, some highlights on that.
Thanks, Alina. And so whilst we had an initial idea of the drivers to net zero, it really depends on the national, legal, political, socioeconomic context as to whether or not and how it's integrated into the legal system. And in many cases, it actually remains a political promise. So starting with work that was done by Net Zero Tracker, we identified which countries have actually pledged economy-wide net zero targets. We then used the climate change laws of the world database to find out which of these have incorporated into an actual piece of legislation. And what we found is that whilst more than 70 countries have national net zero targets now, as of now, only 29 countries and then the European Union climate law has passed these targets into legislation. And as we briefly mentioned earlier in the presentation, some of these are through a new climate framework law, and this is the case in our two case studies for Fiji and Spain. But other countries may choose to amend their existing climate frameworks and make these more ambitious with net zero targets. This is the case, for example, in the UK, South Korea, Ireland, just a few examples there. But interestingly, other countries may have also chosen to incorporate that target through a sectorial legislation. So the example we have here is Austria. They actually include a net zero objective in their renewable energy law, as opposed to an overall climate framework law. And finally, we have also a few examples where the legislative branch of government might adopt an executive strategy that already contains a net zero target. So a well-known one here would be China's 5-year plan, in which the legislative branch formally adopted that. But we also have Slovenia, which adopted a resolution that approves the 2050 strategy. So from previous research by both ourselves, but others in the field, particularly those part of the European Climate Governance Hub, we understand that in order to be effectively implemented, this net zero target has to be supported by an effective national climate governance system. And so as a starting point to actually test this expectation, we looked closely at the net zero targets which were contained within a climate framework law. The rationale being that for countries with such a law, it would likely be a place that they would establish the required mechanisms to implement that target effectively. So to validate this, I'm just going to click to the next slide. There we go. So to validate this and also to provide internationally comparable data, we assessed the linkages across these net zero laws to these 9 climate governance functions. And our data set of laws includes both global north countries, but also global south countries. And we go through each of these with examples in the report, but just to give a high level finding in this presentation, our analysis shows that to date from the top, the strongest linkages are the strategy setting and the long-term objectives, but then the least focus is given to coordination, independent knowledge, and horizontal mainstreaming across sectors. And of course, the nature of having a net zero target means that this is a long-term objective. So it's rather expected that there is a stronger focus on this long-term strategy setting. But interestingly, even with laws that have a strong strategy setting obligations, less of them had positive narratives around reaching net zero, for example, in the preamble or the main provisions that set out the net zero target, which, as Alina mentioned, we noticed the economic opportunity side is actually a key driver to getting support and buy-in to moving towards net zero. And to pick out a few of the gaps that we noticed in this scoping analysis, if we look at independent knowledge, for example, 18 of the laws that we looked at actually did establish or at least grant powers to government to establish a separate body that would provide this expert advice. But actually only just under half of those then referenced to some degree how the government might need to respond or be required to respond to such advice. Similarly, on coordination and on vertical mainstreaming, whilst there are laws with strong references to these kind of mechanisms, the involvement of the subnational institutions and the requirement for coordination bodies to actually report to a senior level of the government is not as clear in the laws. Some laws may also refer to sectorial actions. So the most obvious example being requiring certain ministries to prepare specific sector plans, but the linkages to actually the shared accountability across these ministries or to the requirement that these ministries have a progress assessment by sector are significantly less clear. However, of course, the law that we looked at, so the climate framework law with the net zero target is just one part of the legal and policy landscape in a particular country. And these elements may be reflected elsewhere, other pieces of legislation or other pieces of executive policy that might even predate the net zero target. We still felt that this scoping analysis is very useful to understand which functions have been considered crucial enough to merit direct reference next to the net zero target. But in order to gain a deeper insight, we actually need to have an analysis of the wider governance system. And this is what we did for both Fiji and Spain and tried to get a sense of how it's actually implemented in practice. So I'll pass back to Alina to give you just a quick summary of that analysis.
Yes, so this table here, I won't go into that in a lot of detail, but what is really interesting in the left-hand column for each of the Fiji and Spain, we have tried to qualitatively assess the emphasis on a particular governance function in the climate law itself. And you can see that actually for both countries, in particular for Spain, they rated green on most of the climate governance functions, which are directly addressed in the Spanish climate change law. For Fiji, it's also the case with the exception of independent knowledge, evidence, and advice, which is not directly included in the climate change law. But basically, on the face of it, both pieces of legislation are very strong in linking to the key climate governance functions. However, once we have been doing interviews with experts in the countries, we have asked them to give us their opinion on how they felt those climate governance functions manifested themselves in the implementation phase. And actually to what extent they are strong basically in real life. And the picture is the right-hand side column, and you can see that there is quite a lot of difference between having it on paper and practical implementation. And what is interesting, we can go to the next slide now. So I'll highlight some of the key implementation challenges, which interestingly are quite similar. They have their own nuance for Fiji and Spain, but in terms of the key climate governance functions, which are which require most of the attention, these are pretty similar. And the first one is coordination and horizontal and vertical mainstreaming. This is a challenge across the board in Fiji and in Spain, but also in many other countries we're working with. For example, in Fiji, there has been significant progress in setting up climate focal points and line ministries, which should really help coordination, climate change, and mainstreaming of climate concerns into sectoral plans and policies. However, in practice, competition for very limited financial resources and also shortage of technical capacity create practical challenges for implementing a coherent response, something that Fiji is currently very much focusing on as they advance in the implementation. In Spain, being a multi-level state, there is a huge challenge in maintaining efficient coordination between national and regional governments. That has been highlighted by most of our interviewees. And that results, among other, in a fragmented regulatory landscape across autonomous communities, which particularly creates challenges for private sector, for finance, and may lead to delays in the rapid deployment of renewables, for example. The second pillar, which proved to have important challenges, again, both in Fiji and Spain, but in their own particularities, is mobilization of finance and channeling of that finance towards basically options that are consistent with the net zero objectives. So for Fiji, it's basically raising sufficient finance via international and domestic channels is the deciding factor in whether the country will be able to implement its Climate Change Act and the net zero target. It's as simple as that. And for Spain, there are very important barriers in deploying finance, which partially is that fragmented regulatory landscape, but also highly bureaucratic financial system overall. These were highlighted by our case studies. The third pillar, which requires definitely more attention and has been highlighted as being very important for the successful implementation of net zero, is having a functioning mechanism for independent knowledge, evidence, and advice. As Tiffanie mentioned, this seems to be a gap across all of the net zero laws we have looked at, but in two of our case studies in particular, the importance of having that independent knowledge has been highlighted very, very strongly. For example, in Fiji, many interviewees highlighted the challenges when Fiji was taking the net zero commitment. There was still lack of nationally owned quality data, and therefore the country now is putting a lot of emphasis and effort into establishing monitoring, reporting, and verification systems at the national level, which would allow to create that kind of credible data and to maintain it over time. And also, in the past, there has been quite a lot of reliance on external expertise in Fiji, consultants, which may come and go. And at the moment, there is a concerted effort to build that in-country capacity, including through embedding long-term consultants in the government to help in that respect. And international support is very key in this context. In Spain, everybody we have interviewed, without single exception, has called for the implementation of the requirement in the law to establish an independent advisory body and expressed frustrations around the delay in this process. And finally, inclusive stakeholder engagement. I think this won't be a very unexpected point for many of us working on climate policy and noting the backlash that we're currently facing in Europe and many other countries public backlash against some of the specific measures to address climate change. And that only highlights the importance of running public participation processes early on when the policies are being designed, and also having robust stakeholder engagement. So based on this analysis, our report offers a range of specific policy recommendations for international organizations, national governments, civil society, and also climate finance providers. I won't go into all of them, but I highlight some. I think one top message for us is that up to now, there has been a lot of focus, in particular in the international finance discussions, but also in the domestic debates oftentimes and political campaigns, on getting that political commitment to net zero, and then getting the climate change laws in place that embed that target. These are absolutely critical steps, but what we now need to put more attention to is actually the point that unless that commitment and unless that climate law is then supported by the strong national climate governance system with all of those elements that we discussed, we are going to fail in the implementation of those commitments. And so that is a very important point, which I would like to emphasize both for civil society campaigners, for international finance providers, and also for national governments. There needs to be stronger focus on strengthening national climate governance systems. And in that systemic gathering of knowledge, for those of us joining today from the academic community, there are still very important knowledge gaps in terms of gathering and synthesizing that practical experience on what actually works in practice and different political and socioeconomic contexts in terms of designing specific governance pillars and maintaining that political support throughout the implementation of climate policy. With that, I think there are some specific interventions which are particularly important given the gaps that our analysis has identified. There is definitely a need to strengthen capacity building at the national, subnational, and sectoral levels. And oftentimes when we talk about capacity building, we use this term in the context of developing countries. I think what our analysis shows that is actually across the board. A lot of capacity building needs to be happening actually in every country at different levels of governance. And that includes retaining staff and training staff in the key sectoral ministries to be able to actually engage in the climate debate, to develop strategies and policies necessary to implement net zero commitments, and to ensure ownership, national ownership, sectoral ownership, and also ownership at the regional and local level as we go down through the governance system. And within that, the coordination is definitely a central piece, as I've mentioned before. So clarifying responsibilities, who is in charge of coordination, and strengthening mechanism for horizontal coordination across the sectors and vertical coordination with subnational level of governance is very, very important. I will stop here because I'm also very keen to hear from our experts. So with this, please put your questions in the chat as we go into roundtable section of our meeting today. But first, I go to Katherine, who, as I mentioned, was actually placed with the government of Fiji as the climate finance advisor for several years. And so, Katherine, based on your experience, rich experience in Fiji, but also elsewhere, and as you're heading to the COP28 very shortly to support the delegations there, are the key messages of this analysis resonate with you, and which ones do you think would be relevant for the stocktake discussions that will be taking place in Dubai?
Thanks, Alina. Well, firstly, to say thanks to yourself and Tiff for sharing all of the highlights from this really interesting paper. I think the framework and the governance functions you've identified along with the drivers provide some really great insights into the critical factors to enable the achieve, net zero and Paris alignment. So yeah, you're right. As you say, we're heading into the COP discussions. We're now heading into the political phase of the global stocktake. So the global stocktake is obviously intended to evaluate the progress on climate action at a global level, and will hold all of the countries accountable for the collective efforts against Paris targets that they set themselves in 2015. So this is on cutting greenhouse gas emissions, building resilience to climate change, and aligning financial support. So that's keeping global temperature to well below 2 degrees, but ideally the 1.5 degrees. So within this process, the nationally determined contributions, the main mechanisms by which the countries can communicate that ambition in terms of targets. But the technical phase of the global stocktake, which concluded in June at the Bonn intersessional, and the synthesis report does, as Alina said earlier, underscore this persistent gap, noting that the current commitments are well away from keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees. And then recent analysis of the NDC commitments shows that this isn't happening at the pace or scale needed. So going into this COP, this political phase of the stocktake, the delegates will discuss all of the technical findings and identify the opportunities and challenges for climate action and international cooperation. And those political messages will be referenced in the COP28 final decision text, and they'll be formalized, and those commitments will be adopted, developing the country's climate action. So, net zero, as we know, is an imperative of physics. The only way we can reach this is by limiting the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and remaining within the carbon budgets. We've seen already the IPCC sixth assessment report has stated that human-induced climate change driven by greenhouse gas emissions poses a grave and imminent threat to the planet. And the point is it impacts the most vulnerable disproportionately. So all countries need to drastically cut their emissions with an emphasis on developed countries and shift to low carbon, climate resilient infrastructure. But under the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, CBDR, which acknowledges that all states have a shared obligation to address environmental destruction, but denies equal responsibility of all states with regard to environmental protection. So in this vein, Fiji produces approximately 0.1% of global emissions. So Fiji is neither compelled nor morally obligated to have a net zero target comparable to the UK and other high emitters. So this is where the report findings resonate, particularly interesting in the case of Fiji. So I think, as Alina pointed out, the drivers we're looking at that are very critical to Fiji are the international peer pressure and leadership. And these are all detailed, referring you to section 2 of the paper. So please do read it in detail. So the international pressure and leadership, economic opportunity and access to finance, climate vulnerability, and also the supranational legal requirements. And I thought it was really interesting, the mapping and illustration that you've done there of the drivers and the comparison of the developed versus developing country. So in this context of peer pressure, Fiji's both an early mover and an international leader in climate change. So Fiji first established its National Climate Change Committee in 1998. And then, as Alina mentioned, Fiji has brought the Climate Change Act into law. So the Climate Change Act in Fiji is a piece of legislation that sets out a blueprint of how Fiji will respond to climate change and improve its ability to adapt to the worsening impacts. So I think law is a really important tool that governments can use to have a more strategic, more measured, and better resourced approach. So the Fijian government are responsible for implementing that law, and therefore it's critical that research happens to implement it in an effective way. So in terms of Fiji's kind of climate plans and policies, Fiji's got a robust 5 and 20-year national development plan, which also enshrines net zero by 2050. It's got an updated NDC, which commits to 100% renewables by 2036, a low emission development strategy, a LEDS, a NAP, a national adaptation plan, a national ocean policy, a national climate finance strategy, and NDC investment plan. So, as we've said, Fiji's commitment to net zero is partly driven by its role as a leader in the Pacific region, which is referenced in the paper, and it provides motivation to other Pacific countries, but also as a vulnerable developing country. It's making these ambitious commitments. Fiji can speak with strong and moral authority in international fora, so things at COP, and then against those lagging behind. So there's a lot of emerging lessons here, I think, other countries can use as net zero as a catalyst for action. So another main driver, I think, that resonates with me and experience working in the government Fiji is the economic opportunity, or vehicle is in enhanced access to finance. So it's this has been a really important consideration in Fiji's move towards net zero. So net zero objectives can also help improve energy security. So it's not just a mitigation imperative, and accessing international finance. So Fiji spends approximately 9% of GDP on high-cost diesel imports. So therefore, there's an economic incentive to be more self-sufficient in energy generation. So this has a benefit in improving climate resilience and greater energy security. So any sort of decentralized energy systems makes it more resilient to disaster events. So it's the adaptation nexus as well. So also access to finance is important for the Climate Change Act framework to be implemented. So bringing in that international finance, and the law itself provides framework and strategic direction for where the money should flow and how it should be spent across the horizontal and vertical mechanisms. So as we see from the report, there are loads of barriers as well in achieving the right balance and the 9 core governance functions that are listed. So the coordination, mobilization, challenging finance, horizontal and vertical mainstreaming are particularly relevant in Fiji. And a final element, I believe, has a huge impact on a net zero target are political cycles. So these can have a massive impact, not least in the UK, whether it be backsliding or even granting new exploration licenses. So as we can see, these can have damaging repercussions internationally in the confidence and credibility of that country on the international stage. So in Fiji, we are experiencing different levels of inertia. In 2023, an election changed the political party that was in for 16 years, a party that did demonstrate exemplary credibility and leadership in climate change, led by Bainimarama and the AG Saeed Qayyum. So thankfully, it's not the case, as has been referenced in the paper, that a change in political administration can lead to political reversal as a risk on policy reversal on climate targets. That's not the case here. But unsurprisingly, it has resulted in a huge upheaval in the political spectrum. So governance structures, competing priorities, new institutional architecture, new people, ministries, lack of coordination. But that said, we are seeing strong political will, and Fiji is sending a strong delegation to COP. The new administration has actually been keen to show bipartisanship, working together on issues that affect the nation, such as tackling climate change. So the leader of the opposition party is part of the Fiji delegation. So in this vein, to wrap up, the Climate Change Division remains sitting after the election in a key government decision-making function, which is extremely important in the Office of the Prime Minister. So this is critical in driving and mainstreaming climate policy and action. It's previously lodged within the Ministry of Economy, which helped with financial decisions and financial flows. So I think the robustness of Fiji's policies and plans will play a critical role in mobilizing the finance necessary to implement them. So I'll talk a little bit more about finance later on. Thanks, Alina.
Thank you so much, Katherine. This is fascinating and really useful view of both the challenges and enablers that Fiji faces, but also your thoughts on the implications for the global stocktake, I think, set a very good context for our discussion. We will come back to finance in a minute, but I think I'd like to hear from Mikel as well. I think, Katherine, you've also mentioned the importance of economic opportunity for Fiji, but this point also came very strongly for the Spanish case study. So, Mikel, I was wondering, of course, Fiji and Spain are very different countries, but that economic opportunity came through in both as an enabler to net zero commitment. So in your view, what is the role of opportunity narrative in Spain's net zero transition? And do you already see any evidence of those opportunities expected materializing? And what would be your advice for countries which are currently developing their national climate governance frameworks and legislation in this respect?
Okay, thank you, Alina, for the questions. And well, let me thank you all, especially Alina and Tiffanie, for giving us the opportunity to share with you the release of this report. I think it's very relevant. I enjoy a lot reading it, so I can recommend everybody that is today with us to read it. There are many things that they will be useful, especially now that we are talking about the climate change conference now in Dubai. I think it's very timely discussion, that the one that you are raising in the report. Many things that you have mentioned, no, the promise to go to net zero is done by many countries, but we are not on track. So I think this report will give the audience key aspect on the drivers and the enables to materialize those net zero targets. So my congratulations to you. Actually, I have to say also that the part of Spain, I can say, because I live in Spain. I've been working in this field for a long time, and I think it is very well captured. The overview that you give in Spain and the situations and also the interviews that you did there, I think it's a very good material, the one that you have in the report. So coming back to the question of opportunities, I think, yes, the opportunities was an important part of the narrative of the Spanish government, especially when the cabinet of Teresa Rivera in 2018 started in Spain. But I will add also that it was not just a matter of opportunities. I think it was very important the fact that that administration always put the climate agenda in the top of their agenda. So there was a clear vision that Spain, being a big contributor to CO2, not like Fiji, but Spain is one of the of the rich countries that have contributed a lot to the climate change problem. So there was a clear idea that Spain has to lead also this transition. And of course, Spain has a lot of renewable potential, has a large dependency to fossil fuels. So the opportunity was there, and of course the government used that. At the beginning, there was many report for the international organizations pointing out these opportunities. But the government did in the National Energy Climate Plan and a specific report that we at BC3 have the opportunity to participate in, raising these job opportunities. And they estimate that around 300,000 jobs approximately will be created during this transition to renewables up to 2030. So of course, once they have that report, it was used a lot. And coming back to your question, Alina, are these promising really indeed fulfilled? And the answer is yes, because we have the National Statistic Office in Spain, INE, that has been publishing for 10 years the employment that is being created in environmental sectors. And we are seeing a big increase in the last years. For example, last year we had 20,000 new jobs associated to renewables, to the energy efficiency sectors, and so on. So those promises for green jobs are actually happening in Spain, which is very good for everybody. And also, you asked me about the key aspect, no, that I could recommend on these policies, and most of them have been already mentioned by you, Alina, and by Tiffanie, and also some of them by Katherine. I think it's critical to have a clear political leadership. That this is a key question. transformation to a net zero economy, society has to be credible. So and that should be before we mention opportunities. Otherwise, people will not take so seriously these opportunities, because they will not believe that the government is gonna implement policies. And then, to my view, I think the opportunity part is very important. How we frame the transition in a way that people feel that this is an agenda for prosperity for everybody. And this is the case of most of the countries, I will say, maybe not for countries that are net exporters of fossil fuels, but most of the countries are not, and there are opportunities for most of them. So to frame this in a prosperity agenda is also very important. And I also want to add something that, Alina, you mentioned, no? We have to mention the opportunities, but at the same time, we also have to raise the cost, and those that are going to be hidden by the policies. So the transition is not going to be rosy in everywhere. So I think the government that face these challenges and say very clearly to their citizens are doing a good job, because at the end of the day, if you don't raise also this cost or these barriers, people will feel frustrated, as we are seeing in different countries in the European Union. And the last thing I will add is was also mentioned by Tiffanie, and the participation role of the society. You know, if we want this agenda to move ahead, people need to feel ownership and participate in the discussion. So I think this is something that also in Spain has been done, but maybe as your result shows, maybe it could be done better.
Thank you, Mikel. Really important points here, and I think we'll follow up on some of that. In particular, how do we address disproportionate costs, and how can we use just transition on that? But before we go there, I'd like to go back to Katherine and zoom a bit more on the role of finance. You've already talked a little bit about that in terms of lack of finance being a barrier for implementation, but also potentially the net zero commitment creating an opportunity perhaps to attract more finance. So I wonder, what advice do you have for countries developing national climate governance frameworks in terms of how they can succeed in attracting more climate finance? And there is also a question from Gitanjali Sridhar, who is asking, how can we mobilize the necessary financial resources to implementation of net zero governance in developing countries, and to ensure that these resources are used effectively and efficiently? And there is also another attendee which asks pretty much similar question and saying, you know, are there any principles and approaches in terms of equity at the international level that could help provide adequate finance and adequate support to developing nations for net zero? So lots of questions there, but they all go to the same point. How do we actually ensure there is more finance and that flows to the right places?
Take my mute off. Thanks, Alina. Lots of questions there, and thanks, Mikel, as well for entering this topic as well, and highlighting some of the barriers for Spain and opportunities as well. So yeah, I mean, finance, as is pointed out in the report, is a critical enabler to achieving a net zero policy. So I think as well that characteristics of this can be differentiated between developed and developing countries with regard to the barriers. So just revisiting the global stocktake and the synthesis report. So this is, we know that there's a finance gap. So this underscores the need to reorient trillions of dollars in global finance and mobilize significant resources in support of zero carbon and climate resilient future. So based on my experience working in Fiji and combined with recent research we've actually undertaken at Oxford Policy Management on NDC financing, one way to attract and mobilize more finance, I think, clear evidence is emerging that largely for developing countries, the more well-structured policies and projects are contained within NDCs and project pipelines, the more likely they are to attract finance. So I guess that's not, anything new, but I think in terms of having that pipeline of bankable projects is critical. So this is a huge factor in being able to achieve net zero in Fiji and other countries, but also move along to implementation. So that said, it's not just about attracting the finance. It's, governments need to ensure that they have mechanisms to deliver international finance to national and subnational and local communities. And this is also kind of highlighted within the paper as well. And that those mechanisms for transference of finance are transparent and efficient, as that, donors will need to see the kind of transparency within finance. But it's also the ability to absorb that finance as well. There's projects that are structured. If that finance flows into the government system, that absorption of finance has also been flagged as both a barrier with accessing finance. So I'm not just talking about, when I say finance, I'm not just talking about grants from Annex 1 or developed countries to Annex 2 or developing countries. I'm talking about more innovative financial mechanisms that are available for attracting finance for NDC implementation, therefore reaching net zero. For example, the use of blended finance. So for example, in Fiji, the Global Fund for Coral Reef, and under the recently launched Fiji Blue Bond, which was initially launched at COP26 and now has just been implemented. This uses public finance to de-risk investment in local initiatives and attract private finance into those initiatives, so achieving that potential scale. So also for Fiji and any other country in terms of renewable energy, so a shift to clean energy. It's not really just a mitigation imperative for Fiji, that shift to renewable energy sources or decentralized off-grid energy. Fiji, as we said earlier, spends a huge amount importing high-cost diesel for its transport and energy needs as well, even though we have still around 50% is hydro, but the other 50% is diesel gensets. So, diesel generators and ICE, or internal combustion engine vehicles. And so that it's favorable economically to progress towards net zero. So the scheme I worked on in Fiji Rural Electrification Fund, this is operated by the government, and it's about looking at different, what it's looking at right now is innovative financial models. So, what its ambition is to provide access to clean and affordable energy, de-risk private sector participation, as that's something that is a big gap, particularly in small island developing states, in the private sector entry, but creating a fair and open, competitive renewable energy market. So, noting on Fiji, and also it's highlighted in the report, it's really important for all of preparation work to be done. You can't just access the finance and set up a net zero policy and there you go. It's actually putting the things in place. So things that need to be done are streamlining permitting regulations for renewable energy projects, as highlighted in the report, simplifying administrative procedures to access subsidies or other government support, so that right balance. For example, in FREF, for the project, we needed to work on and rewrite some mini-grid regulations, as there aren't any existing regulations for suppliers for decentralized off-grid. So they needed to be in place beforehand. The other aspect that was highlighted in the report was on MRV. So Fiji still has a fairly nascent emissions inventory and MRV sector. So this is another entry point for international donors, can go in that design, not just sending in a bunch of international consultants to write a plan for an emissions inventory, but actually embedding experts and then doing it through the ministry. So for MRV and the emissions inventory, finance has been accessed from the GEF, which is a fund under the UNFCCC financial mechanism, and it's being implemented by an international expert who's excellent and from Bangladesh, but also through the Ministry of Economy, or through the Climate Change Division mitigation team, and that will develop the emissions inventory and a robust MRV system. So I think, just to sort of conclude, for all countries looking to reach net zero and creating a financing environment for that transition, they need to be aware of the challenges as well as the opportunities. So as Alina and Tiff have told us that, following, the biggest gap, following the country's political promise of a net zero target, the significant task of turning that pledge into a reality is there's a whole body of supportive governance needed. So some critical factors from the report to end with it's policy, that right balance of regulation incentives, particularly for electric vehicles and renewable energy. Clear project pipelines. So this is an answer to the two final questions as well. Having those clear project pipelines containing well-structured and bankable projects, appropriate financial instruments, and that's what you talked about, the taxonomy. So concessional loans, blended finance, and ensuring the banking sector are ready. And then, I think one of the most important thing is having that capacity, so building that capacity, national, subnational, and sectoral level, using different experts. But actually, ensuring the most important thing of building that capacity is ensuring that institutional capacity is maintained within the ministries. So it's to build that capacity and then maintain that capacity. So measures need to be in place to retain the key staff in ministry, the national civil servants that have been trained. And so things, like incentives and career planning and pathways to keep those people, interested in remaining with that government. General awareness, for example, in Fiji, the Climate Change Act is not formally commenced. They need to continue raising awareness for that horizontal and vertical mainstreaming and the governance arrangements. So as Alina said, already in Fiji, the focal points in the ministerial guidelines have been put in place. I think one final call to action, and something I worked a lot on in Fiji, was setting up of a project development unit. And this is in response to the final question of how you can actually access that finance from the international spectrum. So, a lot of the work, so that sits and works at the interface between governments and project pipelines and the ministry focal points in the international finance landscape to create a unit lodged within the ministry, staffed by civil servants, that can understand what projects are needed, what the project pipelines are, and have an understanding of that international finance landscape and can access that finance, in alignment with international, national development plans, and ultimately access sustainable financing that will remain to transition and shift towards a climate resilient future and net zero targets. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Katherine, for this really comprehensive overview and also for highlighting the importance of national ownership to ensure that finance actually goes to where it's most needed. Mikel, I'd like to go back to you now. And in your last intervention, you've highlighted the importance to not just focus on opportunities, but also be aware of the costs, which oftentimes disproportionately affect different groups of population and different economic actors, and could also create disproportional access to opportunities at the same time. And so we in our report noticed that just transition has been both mentioned as the key prerequisite for getting commitment to net zero and successful implementation, but also the failure to regard it could be a significant barrier. And I was wondering, what are the key learnings for you from Spain's experience, which has been, I think, internationally recognized as one of the countries pioneering some of those just transition policies to get political support for net zero? And what governance frameworks can effectively enable implementation of just transition?
Oh, thank you, Aline, for the question. I think as Katherine was saying, we cannot just say that there will be opportunities and wait to see what happens. We need frameworks to take in consideration those regions, households, or places where they are going to be affected mostly, by the transition. So there has to be those frameworks in place. So in the case of Spain, I think there are good examples, in the transition in the coal sector, because in 2018 the coal mines were closed, and there was an agreement between the coal miners, coal mine unions, the coal producers, and the government to do that, to close the mines. And I have to say that it was I mean, this process are always difficult in the territories, and so it was part of an important discussion. But at the end, most of the people that participate in that negotiations have the feeling that the deal that they have reached was fair. Everybody was more or less happy, no? And why I think that happened in Spain. Actually, not only the people were happy. We have a study that we are going to publish soon, where we show that actually the party that was in charge of phasing out the coal mines was electorally successful in the election in the coal mine areas, which typically you expect that it's going to be the opposite. No, they are going to have the political cost, and that didn't happen in the coal mining areas in Spain, which was something that we wanted to take a look because it was surprising. No, so to me, the first thing that you need is to have the framework on just transition. And in the case of Spain, they created the Institute for the Just Transition, and they create a specific instrument, the Just Transition Agreements, where the companies that are planning to close, for example, a coal plant, need to put in place a project that is gonna be designed with the workers, with the local actors in the municipalities, and with the state government and with the regional government to see how new jobs are gonna be created before those that are gonna be lost are going to be lost. So this instrument, I think, provide a credible framework for workers and for these regions to believe that this transition can also create opportunities for them. So these frameworks need to be in place. So we cannot just think that there are be many opportunities because in those places it might happen that they will not be. And then, of course, the participation I already mentioned was key. The feeling of those people in those territories that they were part of this transition, which gives them the ownership, but also the responsibility to find and to design new economic activities in the area. And it's not something that just the state government can do or the companies can do, that everybody should think about how to build new opportunities for those areas. And then another thing that I found important, because I also have the opportunity to discuss with many people in this study that we did in the area. And for many people, it was very important, not only the distributional compensations for the workers that were going to lose the job, but a strategy that was more focused on the whole area, on the whole regional area. So more the project that were designed was think in a way that they should create new activities in the whole regions. So people were not so attached to the idea that compensation to the workers that was enough. So it has to be some kind of economic development plan for the whole area, and that gives the citizens of those places a feeling that they are taken in consideration. So I think that's in the case of coal, the lessons that I learned. And finally, maybe I will say that honesty was also an important part. No, before the new government decided to close down the coal mines. There were many political messages before that you always promise that the coal will keep on in the future, and people didn't believe that. At the end of the day, coal was the most polluting factor in Spain. The European Commission was planning to pursue the close of coal mines. So even workers affected knew that that was not a reality. So telling the people the truth, even if they don't want to listen or they don't want to see that that is the reality, I think that was a good approach from the Ministry for the Ecological Transition. Be honest with the reality, and then try to put a framework that assures that the just transition can happen on those places. And I will stop here, so maybe we can have more time to questions and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mikel. This is fascinating, and really, the points that you've highlighted on the importance of not just focusing on the most affected ones, but thinking about just transition in the overall context of development of the region. It's critically important, just as the point about honesty. We are getting a lot of questions in the chat, which is amazing. Let's try from now on to perhaps be brief, so that we can address more questions. So there is a question from Lydia de Blasi on the role of litigation as potentially an efficient strategy to push governments into adopting climate laws to fulfill the net zero objectives. Tiffanie, do you want to comment on this one?
Yes, sure. Great question. Thank you so much for asking it, because actually a lot of our work at GRI also focuses on climate litigation in this area as well. And I think it's important to highlight that there has been many cases, many government framework cases, which challenge both the ambition of a particular government's actions on net zero, but also maybe the inaction of a government. So in this case, that would be pushing them to do more or adopting a stronger target. I think what's key here is also the link to the framework laws and the legislation side, because having that strong framework law in place can actually help make the litigation more successful. So in the case of New Zealand, there's been many cases that have used the framework law, in Germany as well. And actually one that I believe was just recently, as in today, announced as one of the successes in Germany by a German NGO, challenging the German government's measures in buildings and transport. And that very much builds on the German framework law, which exists, that asks for sectorial actions. So whilst litigation can, of course, in many instances still be appealed and it's not the final verdict, I think the attention around it, being able to challenge the governments to be more accountable, is already a very important impact that comes from the litigation, because there is discussion in the public discourse and political arena about these promises that are already being made in law and then not fulfilled with. I would caveat, however, of course, that litigation is not necessarily always the most effective way or the quickest way. Litigation takes a very long time, as we are well aware of. But even in the cases where it may be successful, there may still be questions about the impact. So an example I'm thinking of is in the UK, there was a successful challenge to the net zero strategy that the government puts out and is required to put out under the Climate Change Act. But after this successful ruling, the government did come out with a net zero strategy, but is arguably less ambitious and less clear than the previous one. So I think there are questions about the strength of litigation in that space, but I think one way to think about it is when you have both, you have a strong legislation and you have litigation as a tool for accountability when those promises are not made, then you have a much stronger governance system there. Thanks.
Thank you, Tiffanie. Very, very useful insight, and definitely exciting developments in this space that confirm the role of litigation as an important lever in ensuring credible implementation. There is a question anonymous attendee is asking, which I think is important, and we haven't touched on that today. How can we integrate adaptation considerations into net zero governance? Can we build resilience to the impacts of climate change into those frameworks? Who would like to take this one first? You volunteers? Link between adaptation and net zero? Katherine, you're smiling. Can I put you on the spot?
Hi, sure. Okay, so I did touch on this a little bit in terms of climate resilience. So I think it's I think it's about, you know, bringing in finance for mitigation. So things like renewable energy pathways and things, so decentralized renewable energy, and that can then help with energy security and mitigation. But I think it's actually about that ability to attract the finance. So same for adaptation and mitigation, and there is a huge emphasis on grants being needed for adaptation, and more finance on and more emphasis on finance being needed for adaptation projects, because it's far easier for the international spectrum to finance mitigation projects because you can see it's much more quantifiable. But I think you can use both the same processes. So therefore, as I said, you know, the more bankable, you know, projects and project pipelines, I think those can be the same, you know, case could be used for attracting finance for adaptation projects, and you're more likely to get grants rather than concessional loans or a need for blended finance in those projects, although those mechanisms or instruments can be used as well. But also it's a case of, so the adaptation, you know, a lot of these mitigation projects have adaptation co-benefits as well. So for example, looking at powering health systems, you're then looking at huge adaptation benefits. So I think it's a case of both accessing finance directly for adaptation using those mechanisms highlighted, but also looking at the mitigation or adaptation co-benefits of mitigation projects, and also you know, being more climate resilient as well. So all of this and reaching net zero can make the country more climate resilient, particularly in the case of Fiji, things like energy security, as we've said, when you have witnessing natural hazards.
Thank you, Katherine. That's really useful. And there is also a question, I think a couple of people voted up on that, so I'll take that real quick. Inquiring whether the full data set from the analysis scoring each law and linkages to the 9 climate governance functions would be publicly available. The answer is yes. We have a detailed, in fact, I should say that we developed the framework not just to get kind of policy insights, analytical insights into the drivers and integration into climate governance function. We wanted also to share the detailed methodology we used so that potentially this can be replicated in a modified form, of course, through a number of countries to create comparable evidence. So the annexes to the report contain very detailed account of what we've done, including what we focused in the interviews and the analysis of the climate laws. But also, if you require more information, please do get in touch with Tiffanie and myself, and we'll be very happy to engage and provide more information. So that's that one. And then there is a very challenging question, which again, a couple of people voted up on, so we should definitely take it. And I'll pose it as an open one to the panel, if anyone would like to come in. In your opinion, are some governance functions clearly more essential than others to enable credible net zero implementation? So who would like to go first? Well, if there are no volunteers, I could start. In my opinion, it's not a very helpful answer. It depends, but actually, what our research shows is that to enable credible net zero implementation, you need some form of governance framework that actually meets all of the functions that we have outlined. The relative importance of one function against the other might be different depending on the national context. For example, we could argue that independent knowledge and expert advice is critically important to ensure both that the quality of climate policy is high, that is based on credible information, but also to ensure accountability of the government, for example, through independent assessments of government's plans and performance on reducing emissions, such as, for example, now is happening in the context of the UK. Independent climate advisory body could actually be a voice that holds the government to account and points out to the gaps between the ambition and the performance. So that is very important in any context, but one could argue that in the context of, say, developing countries like Fiji, their needs in terms of independent knowledge and expert advice at this point, as Katherine discussed, are still kind of at the stage of actually generating the basic data that is necessary to design climate policies. So in that sense, I think I wouldn't be able to rate universally which functions are more important. I think it depends on the national context, but I would argue all of them to some extent need to be met and ensured in the country to be able to enable net zero transition. Would anyone else? Yeah, Mikel, please come in.
Yeah, I agree with what you are saying, Alina, and at least in my experience in Spain, that now we have many regional laws on climate change trying to be passed, and I don't know if it is a function of the government, but what I see is that there are most of the laws now, they include the net zero target to 2050, no? But they are missing intermediate targets, and the architecture and maybe the expert that you are mentioning, Alina, that will be tracking that the intermediate targets can be achieved. Because I mean, we are seeing, no, Tiffanie also mentioned in the presentation that we have also around 70 or maybe 100 countries already pledging to net zero target 2050, but less are specific on what they are gonna get there in 2030. So I think that is an important part of the government to ensure that they are on track to that intermediate targets.
Thank you, Mikel. Katherine.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think the independent advice or independent regulatory body is extremely important, as that means that you don't have the party competition, that both political parties can reference that as is put in the report. But what I thought was just interesting to add to that, I think all of them are important, but from the evidence you showed of by how much in the diagram that you showed, Tiffanie, of how much each of the emphasis is on each of them, that actually, whilst they are all important, you've got much more emphasis on the long-term objectives and hardly any emphasis on the vertical and horizontal mainstreaming. So I think you've got a disconnect there, and actually, perhaps it's a case of there actually needs to be more emphasis on the latter ones, and once you've got to the mainstream, to the long-term objective. So a kind of it's almost a pathway rather than just a chronological succession of points.
Thank you, Katherine. That's really important point. And I think also to respond to a question in the chat by Carlos, because you referred to the analysis that Tiffanie showed, looking across the governance functions. Yes, we did note that even though some governance functions may not be addressed directly in the climate change laws, we use this analysis as to understand where the focus is by different countries. And for the 2 country case studies, we did look at the broader provisions through the key policies that are not just the framework laws, to understand how different governance functions actually manifest in practice. So yeah, we do definitely focus on those gaps, and I agree, the lack of attention to coordination is really concerning and should be a priority going forward, absolutely. Perhaps, Tiffanie, please.
Yes, sorry, it's just a really quick point that links both Carlos's question and what we've just been discussing in terms of the importance of various governance functions. I think coordination is one specifically, that it's not that your framework, your net zero law needs to establish a whole new body that looks at net zero, because there are many countries where they already have a climate commission, a climate coordinating body, or even an environmental coordinating body that can fulfill that role. And we did look at the different, some of the laws would just reference existing bodies that exist, or some will set up new bodies. But I think what's important to highlight there is the focus on their mandate and their responsibilities is the part that is less clear in the laws, and is the part that I think would strengthen and deal with some of the insufficiencies that we've just highlighted here.
Thank you. We have 4 minutes left, but I just wonder if we're really quick, it would be nice to get one more question from Emily, which I think is important. She says that in countries with federal systems of governance, where key areas of decarbonization may fall under subnational jurisdiction, for example, how energy is regulated, should national federal governments play more of a coordinator role of subnational response? Or not? And is the framework the way to go about this, or are there other approaches? So I wonder, Mikel, do you want to come on that, or someone else?
Yes, maybe I can take this one now, because in Spain we have a lot of well, it's a quite decentralized state, and it's always tricky, to have a good level of coordination between the state level and what the autonomous communities, as we call, have. So and it's critical that they are coordinated, in mitigation aspect. Some of the measures of the legislation come from the state, but of course the implementation usually take place in the regions. And adaptation is even more clear, because most of the measures of adaptation are clearly taken not only by regional governments, but actually at municipality level. So there has to be a good balance of coordination. But I don't know how we can improve that aspect. I think just having more coordination and in a more regular basis is something that, for example, in the case of Spain, could work. Actually, a good example of coordination was in the COVID time, where it was very often in Spain that we have meetings. Those working in the health system, with the autonomous communities, every week have meetings to see how they could coordinate. So I think there was lessons learned on that very difficult situation that can also be used in the climate emergency that we also have. So having more coordination is something actually that in my case, not being also Basque, apart from being in Spain, is also something that in the regions we appreciate a lot, that we are listened, that we can participate, and that our knowledge can be useful also for the state level.
Thank you so much, Mikel. This is hugely useful. And interestingly, the example of stepped up and really more effective coordination during the response to the pandemic is something that came up also in other countries we're currently looking at in our work on climate legislation. So definitely an area that we should try to learn from. Sadly, this is all we have time for today. So firstly, I'd like to thank our fantastic speakers for sharing their insights and expertise. Really enjoyed this conversation and learned a lot. I hope you did too. Then I'd like to thank all of you, the audience. You've been very active. Thank you for your questions and staying with us. We hope you will also read the report. And last but not least, I'd like to thank the European Climate Foundation, thanks to whose generous support this research was possible. So thank you, and see you soon.